is critical thinking? That's a hard question, but that's good. Hard questions are good. And how do you do critical thinking? Well, we don't have any answers yet, but we've got some good questions, and that's okay. Hell, that's better than okay. That's good, because rule number 1 for critical thinkers is ask questions. That's what Socrates did. You could call it Socratic method. Call it what you like. I'm going to try to share some of my humble attempts at this critical thinking stuff. This is Garfield High School in East LA where I teach. These are some of my most brilliant students. Whenever I have a tough question, I ask these guys. So I did. I asked them, hey, you guys, what's critical thinking? This is April, one of my geniuses, and she said, critical thinking is thinking. Well, duh. Come on, April. But then I thought about it, and I thought about it some more. You know, that's actually a good answer. Critical thinking is thinking. Hey, it's a start. I mean, what was your answer? You should be making fun of April. It's a great answer. It helps us break down that question into something that maybe we can get a handle on. Okay, so what is thinking? Now, if this was a college paper, I might ask something like, how do we create the circumstances that will provoke thought? Or, what are the circumstances that provoke thought? And like I said, whenever I have a tough question, I ask these guys. So I asked them, hey, you guys, what makes you think? And they all kind of shouted at once. When something gets our attention. Okay, very good. Something gets your attention and it makes you think. So I said, suppose you're looking out the window and you see some guy running naked down the street. Or suppose April looks out the window and sees some guy, and it makes her think. Her mind is racing, full of questions. April has seen a naked guy before, but running across the grass in front of the school? Well, yes. In broad daylight? Sure, but not during second period. This is strange, and she's full of questions like, why is this guy naked? Why doesn't my boyfriend look like this guy? And how can I get him to ask for my phone number? All kinds of questions. But the most basic question we ask in this situation is, what's wrong with this picture? I think this is the question that we're asking when we think critically. Something gets our attention because it doesn't fit with our understanding of how the world works. We can't fit it into any of the slots we have in our heads for putting information. We can't assimilate it, as Piaget would say. So we have to alter our internal theories in order to accommodate this new information. Big stuff going on in our heads. But if you're not looking out the window and you don't see the guy running naked, you don't get to ask all those important questions. So rule number 2 in critical thinking is, stop listening to your teacher and look out the window. Nah, for real, just kidding. We could say rule number 2 is, pay attention. You can't spot what's wrong with the picture if you're not involved in looking closely at what's going on. But this brings us to another critical point, especially for teachers, which is that if you want people to think, you have to get their attention. And if you want to get their attention, you have to present challenging material. Students need to see information that demands their involvement because it doesn't fit into their current way of thinking. If we want to think critically, we have to learn to look for trouble. But to do that, we need to get our hands on material that contains trouble, problems, anomalies, things that are not normal. We need practice looking at material that makes us ask the question, what's wrong with this picture? So let's rewrite rule number 2 to say, look for trouble. We can take this approach of looking for trouble and apply it to old material as well as new. For example, Odysseus and the Cyclops. In the story of Odysseus, the Greeks come to steal from the Cyclops. They find there's no one in his cave and immediately begin helping themselves to his things. Cyclops comes walking in, sees what's going on, sees what the Greeks are doing, and says all casual, hey, what's up? Are you guys honest, hard-working traders? Or are you pirates come to rob me? Well, the Greeks are not honest, hard-working traders. They're not traders of any kind. They just finished looting Troy, killed all the men, raped all the women, stole all the valuables, and burnt the place to the ground. The Greeks are pirates. Read the story, you'll see. They did the same thing to every city on the way there and on the way back. And now they want to steal from Cyclops. And we're supposed to be on their side? Why? Because Cyclops is different. Ew. One eye. Ew. He's probably a different color. Probably eats weird stuff like tamales and menudo, and therefore he's evil. Obviously. Who questions it? But Cyclops has speech. He's intelligent. He has feelings. It's his work that's filled his cave with the stuff the Greeks want to steal. But he has no right to his possessions? Why? Why are we supposed to sympathize with the pirates? Our civilization celebrates Odysseus, and it's no wonder why. George Washington made his fortune murdering Indians and stealing their land, enslaving Africans and stealing their lives and labor, raping African women, stealing their common children, and selling his own children for profit. Of course he celebrates Odysseus. Finally, says George, here's a guy I can relate to. The ruler pirates of our culture identify with the robbing, murdering, raping, enslaving Greeks. And that's okay for them, I guess. But what about us? We're the robbed, not the robbers. We're the sheep, not the wolves. But we have been so brainwashed that we root for the bad guys as they rob and slaughter our comrade, the honest, hard-working Cyclops. Which I suppose brings us to rule number 3 of critical thinking. Pay attention to the subtext. We have to pay attention to what the speakers don't say. They don't not say it because it's a secret, but because they don't need to say it. Everybody already knows. This is what's called the subtext. In the Odyssey, nobody says, "Hey, it's great to be pirates." It's not in the text, out in the open, but it's underneath at the bottom. In every story the Greeks tell, it is assumed that it's great to be a pirate. It's underneath the text in the subtext. It's not an obvious point. Let's try putting it in another way. You have to be careful, on the lookout for what assumptions are being made by the person telling the story, and you have to ask yourself if you agree with those assumptions. We share a world with pirates, and when they talk, we have to pay attention to the story they are telling us, and we have to be careful not to let them tell us who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. One of these guys stole from the rich and gave to the poor. The other stole from the poor and gave to the rich. You choose which one is the hero, but pay attention and ask questions, and don't accept someone else's assumptions. Okay, let's change gears a little bit. We're going to get theoretical for a minute, but don't freak out. It might actually be useful. Hey, it could happen. You often hear people talk about inductive logic and deductive logic. Well, sometimes you do, not very often. Okay, never. But the education textbooks use these terms, so maybe we should consider what they mean. Inductive logic is not really logic at all. It is speculation. It's just a guess. It's ideas that pop into your head as a result of looking at and examining the world around you. We look around and ask, what do these things have in common? For example, we might look at these guys and say, all athletes wear funny-looking shorts, or 2 out of 3 athletes play with their balls. A more scientific way to ask the question might be,
what generalized law can we attempt to construct that will account for all known characteristics of the phenomenon?
What can we say about the stuff we're looking at? Galileo looked at stuff. The story is that he used to drop things off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and he noticed something, besides that they go splat. He noticed that objects of very different sizes and weights all seemed to fall at about the same speed. That's not what people expected. Everybody thought that the biggest objects would fall fastest, but they didn't, which allowed Galileo to discover one of the most important rules of critical thinking. It doesn't matter what everybody else thinks. What matters is what the evidence says. Galileo also looked up at the sky, and he saw that each night the planets, Mars for example, appeared in a different position. It moved in a strange loop. And he looked at the theory that man and the earth were at the center of the universe, and he said, "You're wrong. The evidence doesn't support that theory." The theory was wrong, which should come as no big surprise since it was based on inductive logic. And as you may recall, inductive logic is not proof, it's just a guess. And guess what? Galileo was wrong too.
He thought the planets went around the sun in perfect circles. He was wrong. The orbits are squash circles. They're oval, elliptical. Galileo's theory and all theories are eventually proved at least partly wrong. So inductive logic is weak and unreliable. It's like democracy. It's lousy, but it's the best we've got. Which is why we desperately need people who can spot the problems in the evidence and say, hey, this doesn't fit the theory. There's something wrong with this picture. Deductive logic is, in a sense, the opposite of inductive logic. As we just saw, inductive logic takes a set of observations and tries to induce from them a general rule or theory about how things are. Deductive logic starts with the general rule and then tries to make predictions about what else must be true if the general rule is true. In geometry, deductive logic is very effective.
If we construct an angle bisector for the interior angle of an isosceles triangle, then the angle bisector will also bisect the opposite sides.
A perfectly straight line doesn't exist in real life. But in geometry, a line is straight if we say it is. In geometry, a circle is always a perfect circle. And the general rules are what we say they are. But the real world isn't that way at all. As we saw with Galileo, the only thing you can ever be sure about the general rule is that it is at least partly wrong. In the real world, there is only one real use for deductive logic, and that is to help develop a test to see if the general rule is true. This test that we develop is called a testable hypothesis, and it works like this. For example, one of the kids at school said that mom is a $2 whore. This can be considered a general rule or theory. In order to test this theory, we might use the general rule to develop or deduce a specific guess called a hypothesis. For example, we might say, if Mom is a $2 whore, she ought to have a grip of $2 bills laying around. This is a testable hypothesis. We can now test the hypothesis. We can look around for evidence to see if the hypothesis is true. So we sneak into Mom's room and look into her drawer, and what do you know, $2. Well, that's evidence, and it does tend to support the theory, but it's not much. It's pretty thin. So we try in another drawer. Surprise, surprise, a stack of $2 bills. And then we look under the bed. Hey, Mom, if you had a part-time job, you'd tell me, right? And hey, can I borrow $2? We can use deductive logic in this way to build evidence to support or to disprove a theory. This may be a better example. Some geologists noticed that you can fit South America into Africa, and he theorized that maybe they once actually were stuck together. Okay, we can now use deductive logic to produce a testable hypothesis. If Africa and South America were once together, then the mineral deposits here on the west coast of Africa should match the mineral deposits here on the east coast of South America. The geologists went out digging to get the evidence, looking under Mom's bed, so to speak, and what do you know? The hypothesis tested true. Not only did the minerals match, but the fossils matched too. In this way, using deductive logic to develop a testable hypothesis, it was possible to develop powerful evidence that the theory is true. No, this is not about the Pope and sexually transmitted disease. It's about the abuse of deductive logic. Alexander Cockburn is a writer for The Nation magazine. He pronounces his name Coburn. I'm not blaming him for that. If my name was spelled Cockburn, I'd pronounce it Coburn too. Hey, I'd change the way it was spelled while I was at it. The point is that the Pope and this guy Cockburn both have abused deductive logic. Let's take the Pope first. Back in the days of Galileo, not that long ago really, the Pope said, God gave his only son for us to torture, kill, and mutilate horribly. Therefore, God must have made man the center of the universe. Therefore, the universe must revolve around man and the earth. As a sample of deductive reasoning, I really have no quarrel with this. This is solid logic, as near as I can tell. But obviously, this is not good science. If this statement has any value at all, it is as a testable hypothesis. If God gave us his only son to torture and kill, then it seems reasonable to conclude that he would have made man the center of the universe. However, if we take this last part as a testable hypothesis, the evidence proves the hypothesis is false, so that there must be an error, either here or here. The point is that neither the Pope nor anybody else should try to dictate what the real world is like using deductive logic. You have to look at the evidence. Alexander Cockburn writes for The Nation magazine. He's a big name on the left, not quite the Pope, but a guy can dream. And he says, capitalism is monolithic. That is, all rich people think alike. They would never kill one of their own. Kennedy was a member of the capitalist class. Therefore, ipso facto, he thought just like them. He could never have disagreed with them about anything important, like Vietnam, for example, and they would never have any reason to kill him. Therefore, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing the president. Again, this is Cockburn's attempt at deductive reasoning. And it's an okay example of deductive logic, I suppose, as long as you understand that's what it is. It's deductive logic. And the statement, Oswald acted alone, is only useful as a testable hypothesis. But we have to examine the evidence. We ought to be able to take a couple of minutes to look at what is probably the most important historical event in the last 100 years. Oswald supposedly shot Kennedy from behind. But as you can plainly see, the shot threw Kennedy violently backward. Every witness in the area said that shots were fired from several directions, including the front. These people are running up the grassy knoll in front of Kennedy to try to capture some of the killers. And virtually every doctor in Dallas described a large exit wound in the back of Kennedy's head. All of the most credible evidence shows that while Kennedy was also shot from the rear, the shot that blew his brains out came from the right front, a shot that could not have been fired by Oswald. If capitalism is monolithic, you can't prove it in this way. If we take the statement, Oswald acted alone, as a testable hypothesis of the theory the capitalist class is monolithic, the evidence we just saw shows both statements to be false. In any case, there are a couple more rules about critical thinking that need to be mentioned here. Again, that evidence is primary. Pay attention to it. Read what it tries to tell you. Deductive logic and assumptions should always be overruled by the evidence. A second point is that you sometimes have to have a great deal of courage to believe the evidence of your own eyes. It isn't always the easiest thing to do. For example, when Galileo said, "Hey, the evidence doesn't match the theory. Man is not the center of the universe," the Pope didn't like that very much, and he had his boys snatch Galileo and take him down to the torture chamber where they heated up an iron bar until it was red hot, and then they said, "Hey, Galileo, we heard you like to look at the planets. We heard Uranus was one of your favorites. Well, how'd you like to see us shove a red-hot poker up your favorite planet?" And Galileo thought about that. He thought about his favorite planet getting a red-hot poker shoved into it. Galileo thought about it for about 2 seconds, and then he decided he would take back everything he'd said and shut the hell up. Which brings us to rule number 4 of critical thinking. Be prepared to be tortured. You remember the emperor's new clothes, the little kid who pointed to the king and laughed at his naked butt? You think that kid got rewarded? They showed him what they showed Galileo. So you got to have courage to be a critical thinker. We're going to look at some recent controversial material, and you're going to get your own chance to be a critical thinker. But before we do, let's review what we've learned so far about critical thinking. Rule number 1, ask questions, all kinds. Rule number 2, look for trouble, for things that don't fit. Ask, what's wrong with this picture? Rule number 3, pay attention to the subtext. What assumptions are being made about who is good and who is evil? Number 4, rely on the evidence, not on your own assumptions about what's going on. And finally, have the courage to believe your own eyes. It's harder than you think. This may be a good spot to take a break, because you're going to be asked to do your own hard work in part 2, as we look at the war on drugs and examine what is probably the most important drug case in the last 50 years.